Hello and welcome to Complex SQL Queries. You should have already downloaded the template from Blackboard, and as soon as the template is open on your desktop, one of the things you want to do is work Save As and find a suitable folder to put that in, and you want to give it your name. We're going to use a hypothetical name like Cami Johnson, right? And complex SQL queries or query. We're going to enable the content, and the first thing we want to do is check to see if these tables, T auctions, T bidders, and T bids from our module 4 solution are still related properly. And here you see the bids table has an auction ID join one-to-many relationship with the auctions table through the auction ID field, and to bidder ID from the bidders table through bidder ID, one-to-many, same kind of thing. So we're good there. The first thing we want to do after we've set the stage then is to create two quick basic queries that generate descriptive statistics for auction bid averages or bid sums and bidder sums. So we're going to be using the bids table. We're going to create using a query design, and we're going to select the bids table. And the first thing we're going to do is drag auction ID down to the field. Might be easier to just slide this up so that it's closer. And we're going to drag two of the bids fields into the columns and select totals so that we can group by sum and group by count. And now we're going to save the query and see if that produces the kind of result we need. So we're going to call this Q because it's a query, and we're going to call this auction stats with an S, and then we're going to run it, and what you see are the sum of the bids and the count of the bids for each auction. This is what we want. We're going to make one more enhancement to this just because it's going to be a little easier to see when we break it out. We're going to highlight this and then enter a caption over here. And the caption we're going to use is auction bid total and auction bid count. So auction bid total, we can use spaces here. We're going to hit enter, otherwise it doesn't work. And let's just view that, save it and run it. And now if we double click this, we have a little more of a descriptive title up here, auction bid total as opposed to sum of bid, count of bid. It's not as obvious what's going on here sometimes. You'll see in other tables this is useful. We're going to do the same for count of bid. So we're going to hit the column to highlight it. And if this doesn't show in the properties sheet, you can always right click and hit properties. But we're going to enter, well, let's see what we're going to enter. Auction bid count, yeah. So now if we save it, view it, now we have auction bid total, auction bid count. We're going to save this and close it. I'm going to do the same for bidders. We're going to have bidder stats. So we're going to create a design query with the bids table. We're going to add that table. We want to break out the bidder stats based on the auction. So we're going to actually slide auction ID down here first again, and then bidder ID. And this is an important thing because we want to make sure that this is one of those key anchors that allows us to relate better. We're going to put 3 bid totals down here. Actually, we're going to go a little further this time. So we know we're going to want the bidder average after the point, but we also have to distinguish what the bidder totals or sums for bids were at each auction and the count of bids at each auction in order to work another part of a query later. We're going to save this. We have to hit totals, totals, and we're going to group by, we're also going to ascending order here, ascending order there. We're going to group by the sum of bids by bidders. Now that we're doing bids this way with bidders here next to it, it's going to give us the bids of the bidders, not the auction totals, but the bidder totals. Sum of bidder totals, the count, and then the average. We're going to save this, and just like the last one, we're going to start with a Q and call it bidder stats, and we'll run it. And yes, you see that for there were 6 bidders involved: bidder 1, bidder 2, bidder 3, bidder 5, and bidder 6, and bidder 7. Bidder 4 was out that day, I guess, but there was only, in our initial data, there was only 1 count. We're going to do this in a way where if the bids are updated, then the sum will update, the count will update, and the average will update. We'll see that in a minute. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and we'll do the same here with our captions because we want something a little more descriptive. We'll use bidder bid total, bidder bid count, and bidder average. And I know that sounds a little redundant, but basically bidder criteria can involve more than bids. So bidder bid total, bidder bid count, bidder bid count, and the last one would be what? Bidder bid average. And notice I'm hitting enter after each one. I'm going to save this. I'm going to run it. Now I can double click at the top, and I have more descriptive titles here, which are going to be helpful later. If you have so many sums and averages and counts in different tables and in different queries, if you don't distinguish between them, it gets to be pretty difficult. But you see here, if we had more of a bid for auction 1, bidder 1, and if they entered another bid, a high one, then the bid count would change and the bid average would change. Just to make sure this is working right, I'm going to close this, and I'm going to open the bids table, and I'm going to add a 38th bid for auction 1, bidder ID 1, and I'm going to put let's see, 12.1, 24.3. Yep. So I'm going to close that. Now let's see if the bidder stats changed. And indeed, for auction ID 1, for bidder 1, now the bid total for bidder 1 is 36.4. It was 12.1. There are 2 bid counts because there was a second bid for 24.3, and the bid average is 18.2. Okay. We're going to close this, and then what we're going to do next seems a little counterintuitive, but we just created two new database objects, queries, which create a view when run, and that view can be treated like a table that can be related. So we can extend our data mining by relating these two to the original tables up here. So to do that, we're going to go into our database tools, click on relationships. We're going to hit show table, but instead of the tables tab, we're going to click queries tab. We're going to add the auction stats and then the bidder stats. And let's drag bidder stats down here and auction stats over here. And let's start between auctions and auction stats. We want to create a relationship, so we're going to join auction ID in this query to this table. Because we're drawing between a query and a table, some of the other options we would normally have for forming a relationship or joining enforce referential integrity, one-to-many, yada, yada, yada. We can define the join types. We're going to leave the default, include only rows where the joined fields from both tables are equal. And we're going to create. And now we have a link, join between auction stats and auctions. We're also going to do the same between bidder stats and auction stats. So with regard to auctions, if there's a statistic that we want to extend to bidder stats, we're going to do the same thing through the auction ID. And that's why we included auction ID there. That keeps it clean. And we're going to accept the default for the join. We're going to create this. And we're going to save our new relationship and then close. Now that we've established a relationship between the queries and the tables, we can actually query the queries, the auction stats and the bidder stats, to generate or render breakout of bidder stats and average differences. So we're going to use expressions, and we're going to extend relational algebra. The first step here is to click create, and we're going to have a query design, but we're not going to use tables this time. We're going to use the two queries, auction stats and bidder stats. What you notice is that the relationship already appears. That's kind of nice. We're going to go ahead and the first thing we're going to do is drag the auction ID from the auction stats table and the bidder ID from the bidder stats table down here, and then sort them ascending order. So auction ID, and then bidder ID, and ascending, and ascending. And what we'd like to do is show the sum of bids for the auction and then subtract the sum of bids for the bidder. So we're going to drag this down here and this down here. Now at first it looks like we have the same field we're searching for, but the sum of bid comes from auction stats and sum of bid comes from bidder stats. So we'll get to that more in a minute, but what we want to do is change the caption again so we have a decent point of reference, and we're going to use auction bid total and bidder bid total, and that's going to be easier to remember, auction bid total instead of sum of bid and sum of bid, right? So auction bid total and then bidder bid total. if we save this, and we're going to use Q because it's another query, and we're going to say bidder breakout. That's what we want, because this is going to be pretty sophisticated. It'll be nice when we're finished. So let's save it, let's run it, and what we get is auction bid total and bidder bid total. So now as we're looking across the results or the output that's rendered, it'll make more sense instead of sum of bid and sum of bid, blah, 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 blah. We're going to subtract this column from this column to give us the competitor bid totals. At each of the auctions, if we take out the bids from the bidder we're interested in, all the rest that are left are the competitors. So that's the basis for part of our analysis here. So we're going to use an expression. And in order to do that, I'm going to shrink this down a little bit here so we have a little more room. And we're going to give the expression a name, and we want to assign this with a special option under totals. So instead of grouping by one of the fields, we're going to enter the name that we're going to use. We'll call this the delta, the bid delta. So the delta meaning difference between the bids for the bidder and the bids for the auction. So I'm going to call this bid delta. And let's see, I think that's what we were going to use. Yep, bid delta. And that's just as a formula reference. And then we're going to subtract this from this. Now when we're writing the expression, we have to include the query name with the field name separated by a period. So what we're going to do is stretch this out a little bit. We have more room. And I'm going to put in a set of parentheses just to make this easier. So I'm going to take the Q auction stats sum of bid and subtract the Q bidder stats sum of bid. So Q auction stats dot sum of bid. I'll close the parentheses. So that's one quantity or one field, and that represents this expression here represents these outputs. I'm going to subtract from the Q bidder stats dot sum of bid. That expression represents what's output here. I'm going to close the second parentheses, hit enter, and I'm going to group by the expression option because it's not a total, but we want access, we want the database to understand that this is an expression that's going to render as bit delta. When you look at the SQL, that's what happens. We want to save this. We want to view it. And okay, so we have bid delta here, which was the expression name, followed by the colon there, but we want to give this something that's more descriptive. So we have auction bid total, bidder bid total, and this could be competitor bid total. So we'll go back into this view. We'll right click, go to properties. We're going to put competitor bid total because that's what it really is. We want a clear view of what we're doing as we work across this process. So I hit enter. It highlights black. I save my query. I view my query. Now when I double click, it makes room for competitor bid. And as you go down the columns, you see that the expression has done its job. If I have 85.61 here, and then I have a bidder total of 36.5, 4. And then what's left for competitors in that auction, auction number 1, if I take all of the rest of the bidders, bidder number 2, bidder number 3, bidder number 5, bidder number 6, bidder number 7, and I look at theirs, you'll see that the competitor bid is different. And you'll notice that as we look at competitor bid number 2, it's comparing what bidder 1 did, bidder 3 did, bidder 5. So each of the results are different. This may not seem like a big deal, but you'll see in a minute why it's so powerful. All right, so now we have the sums, the difference of the sums, and we also have the counts. In this auction, we had six different bidders for auction number 1. In auction number 2, we only had 3 bidders, 5, 6, and 7. Further down, you'll notice here, in auction 6, there were only 2 bidders, 5 and 6. So this is just sample data we're using for demonstration purposes. But the point is, we want to take this further. If we had, we have different numbers of bidders in each auction, and if we're doing averages, we have to account for the differences, and then we have to take out 1 or 2, depending on the number of bids by a specific bidder, so that we can get an effective average, because an average is the total divided by the count. That's what we're going to do next. Same process we used here. Auction total, the bidder difference, and then we're going to take the 2 and divide. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to go ahead here, and this time we're going to grab count of bid from the auction stats table, because we want to know how many bids were counted that we have to divide to get the average. And then we're going to do the count of bids for each bidder, because there could be cases where a bidder bids on more than one auction. All right, and we want to see if that rendered properly, so we're going to save and run this, and sure enough, you see for auction 1, bidder 1, there was a second bid, and so you're going to see a difference if this works out right. We'll do the same thing to create a delta for the count. Let's go back in here, and we'll move over a little bit. For the caption here, I'm going to use auction bid count and bidder bid count. And when we finish getting the difference, we'll have competitor bid count. And then we'll be able to compute the competitor bid average. So, auction bid count, bidder bid count, let's just make sure we save that and see if it renders properly. Auction bid count, bidder bid count, yes. And we're ready to create a new expression now. So we're going to do the same thing here with the expression. If we forget to include the bids, we'll get an error. Something about aggregate functions. And so if you see aggregate functions error, it means that you forgot to drag the counts down, because the counts here are needed for the calculation that's adjacent. So we're going to have count delta this time with a colon, and let's move this over so we have lots of room. Two left parentheses, and then we're going to distinguish between auction stats and bidder stats for the same process. Q auction stats with a period, and then count of bid. Instead of sum of bid, it's count of bid now. Close parentheses, minus open parentheses, q bidder stats dot count of bid, and then a second close parentheses. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to group by expression. I want to see if this renders properly. I'm going to save and run it. And sure enough, I have 7 total bids that are counted in auction 1. Bidder 1 made 2 bids, so the count against competitors in that case, there were 5. There were 5 for that particular round. You'll notice for the other bidders, they had 1 bid and it was subtracted from 7, and so on down the page. So this is working properly. We want to have competitor count total, so we're going to add a caption there. So competitor count total, as this query is used in other relational algebra deep dives, it's going to render competitor count total. I think that's what we're supposed to use, right? Yeah. Oh, competitor bid count. Competitor bid count. Sorry about that. And if we go ahead and save that, run it, expand it, we have auction bid count, bidder bid count, competitor bid count. Now we can calculate the average for the competitors because we have the sum of their bids, we have the number of bids that were made, so we can calculate, because we have it by count, we can calculate the average. That's the last expression column we're going to generate. We're going to do the same here, only we're going to call it, let's see, what are we going to call it? Competitor bid. We're going to call it competitor av, and then we're going to use the caption competitor bid average. So competitor av. And this is going to be an easier expression because what we're going to do is refer to count delta and bid delta. We're going to divide bid delta by count delta. Bid delta, close, divided by, open parentheses, count delta. We're going to put a second parentheses there, hit enter, and we're going to call this an expression. I'm going to group by expression. We want to run this after we save it, and yes, we get competitor averages. Another thing we can do here is we can fix the column so that it renders 2 decimal places instead of this long running. So we're going to go back in here, finish with the caption, which we said was competitor bid average. And we're going to pull down in the fixed, that'll give us 2 decimal places. We'll save, we'll look at it, and now we have competitor bid average with 2 decimal places. So this is the bidder breakout. One of the coolest things you can do is export this data mining result, and with larger data sets you have some really interesting trends that you can analyze with numerical analysis. We'll show you how to do that at the very end. For now, what we're going to do is save this and close it. We now take our bidder breakout and we want to relate it again to the original tables and the first two queries so that we can extend and dive deeper. I'm going to Database Tools, Relationship. We're going to show the table, except we're not showing a table. We're listing a query. We're going to put the bidder breakout in place. We'll drag the corner down so it looks a little nicer. Get it about here. I want to associate the auction ID, this breakout, with the auction stats. Again, because we're going to be centering a lot of the queries around auction IDs. We're going to check the join type just to make sure it's default. It is. We're going to create it. And we're going to save this. We're going to close this. And we're ready for our final query of queries. So in the end, in solution 3.5 in our course textbook, we want to show the names of the bidders, their average bid, and we want to look at the average bid of their competitors for each of them at each of their auctions. And so in order to do that, we're going to take advantage of one of the tables, the bidders table, because that's where the names are, and we're going to take advantage of the breakout we just created and the bidder stats, because that has the bidder average. So we're going to create a query again, and this time, let's see, which one are we going to associate first? Check my notes here. Yes, so we're going to start with the bidder breakout and the bidders, and then we'll add the bidder stats. So bidder breakout, let's drag that. Let's go to the bidders table, and we'll close this for now. So we need to drag this down so it isn't quite so ugly, and drag this down so it's a little nicer. And let's see, what are we going to drag down here first? We're going to drag down the bidder ID. We're going to sort in ascending, but we're not going to show it. Then we're going to drag down the first name and the last name. Now, in order to drag down the bidder average, we don't have that. We need the bidder average from the first table, bidder stats. So we're going to save this. We'll call this Q because it's a query, and we're going to say bidder competitor average comparison. I know that's a mouthful, but bidder competitor average comparison. And so we're going to right click the desktop and this gray space here and show tables. We're going to go to the queries and select bidder stats. You notice the relationships are already there, and see the cascade of the joins. That's what makes relational databases so powerful. There's our average of the bid. That was something we calculated at the very beginning. And the bidder average is different than the competitor averages and the auction averages. So we need our average of bid here, And we need our competitor average here. What we want to do is save this and run it. And we get 203 results when we only had 37 bids to begin with and 7 bidders in 10 auctions. What happened? Well, what we're doing is showing bid averages for the bidder, in each case with competitor bid averages, and it's basically generating, it's a combination query. This isn't what we want. What we want is a simple list by name of the 7 bidders. So we want an average of their averages, because what you see here are averages at each auction, and you see competitor averages at each auction. So what we're going to do is go back into here, and we're going to select totals, and we're going to group by average and average. So it's going to average the average from each auction. Each auction has an average, and we want the grand average, or the total average, or the mean average. I don't, say it how you want. You want an average of an average. When we render this in the query, it's going to look ugly, which is another reason why we're working with captions. But let's make sure it runs. So let's save it and run it. And sure enough, we get a decent result. We get the correct result. And if you look at, now we added a record for Adam Cooper, but if you look at the rest of the values in the textbook in solution 3.5, you'll see that from Brian on down, the bidder average of averages for all of the auctions tracks with this. And it's messy because of the extra decimal places. We're going to clean that up in a minute. We have one more thing to do. We're going to go into view. We're going to select this. We're going to add a caption, and that caption is going to be bid average for bidders. Yeah. And on this one, bid average for competitors. If we look at this, oh, we want to get rid of the decimal places. We're going to jump back into here and select fixed format. And then fixed format. And that should do it. Save, run. Oh, so nice. One of the powerful things about scientific data applications is that you can work numerical analysis, advanced numerical analysis, and then deep data mining in tandem. So in a previous solution, you learned how to import a data file, a CSV file, to create a table. Now what we want to do, the last thing we want to do, is we want to look at, let's see, our breakout. Our breakout had a lot of interesting results. We want to export that, so we're going to select the query here. We can close this, by the way. We're going to save the changes. We're going to select bidder breakout. We're going to go to the external data option. We're going to select the export to Excel spreadsheet. This one's import from Excel. This one's export. We're going to export the data with formatting and layout, and then open the destination just to make sure we've got it. And go ahead and accept this. I had one in there before, so I'm going to say yes. Then here you see the Excel spreadsheet. So if I wanted to do numerical analysis, I wanted to do something like a Markov chain, or wanted to wanted to see about linear regression, multiple linear regressions. This is how I would develop the data sets. This concludes, we can close now. You're going to want to submit this final access database and your Excel spreadsheet, but check it against the rubric to make sure that you've met all the rubric criteria. If you followed along with this video walkthrough, you've got it. This concludes our walkthrough of a complex SQL query. Thanks for joining us.